it to do?
For distance. I don't think we actually record them when it's in the room.
I don't know. It's a good question. So thank you all for coming. As you all know, this is Alex Olshansky's dissertation defense. He has prepared a talk, and I instructed him to make it somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes long. As those of you that have seen the document know, that's going to be a land speed record given how many predictions and his analysis. But I told him to keep it as concise as possible because those of us that have read the document can talk at length later on about all of the little minutia. But for the point of this talk, it's more about, hey, what did I do? How did I do it? What did I find? And why is it cool? And so we're going to allow Alex to talk for a little bit. Then we'll have time for public questions. And then we will kick all of the public out and just have our private meeting. Then we will kick Alex out and have the committee meeting. And then we will invite Alex to come back in at the end. So does anybody have any questions before we turn it over to Alex? Okay, perfect. So unless your name is Alex Olshansky, you should turn off your camera and make sure that your mic is muted up, and then we will let him get started.
Okay, you can all hear me? Can you all see my slides?
Yes, we all muted ourselves, Alex, so.
Okay, okay, okay. Hi everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. I really do appreciate it. Again, there's a lot to cover here, so I'll just jump right in. The title of my dissertation is Conspiracy Processing and Diffusion Model, CPDM, the role of emotion in conspiracy uptake and diffusion. And so the overarching goal for this work is, as the title kind of alludes, is to develop a predictive model that can effectively predict under what conditions is conspiracy adoption and diffusion more or less likely. And so that's the focus of this work. Now, it's not moving. There we go. Early on during the COVID pandemic, so this was like May 2020, so right after everything had just kicked off in March, most of us were still kind of locked in our homes. I received a message in my Facebook Messenger chat from my dad, which was a link to a YouTube video. This YouTube video was a film called Plandemic. If you're unfamiliar with Plandemic, what it was essentially is a conspiracy film that alleges, among other things, that a cabal of elites at the top of the medical industry essentially conspired to unleash the coronavirus onto the world in order to profit from vaccine manufacturing. And that this Dr. Judy Mikovits is hailed as kind of the brave whistleblower who exposes all of this information. And she's so aptly titled doctor to give her extra credibility. But this film not only contained conspiracies, kind of high-level conspiracies, but also just bad information about vaccines. It was talking about how masks make you more sick by keeping the bad bacteria out. There's all this kind of stuff that was going around in the early days of the pandemic. But nevertheless, this film went viral and was racked up millions and millions of views in a very short period of time, in a time, a very sensitive time. Think about it, very dangerous time for this kind of misinformation to spread, not unlike the virus itself. And so we know that conspiracy theories have, in essence, been around with us since the dawn of mankind, essentially. But more recently, we've seen this kind of proliferation of conspiracies online. So there's these kind of digital wildfires that spread very rapidly. And we've seen, it seems like there's a new conspiracy every week these days. But we've seen them, related to science-related conspiracies, health-related conspiracies, politics, you name it. But this is really kind of what drives and piques my curiosity and drives my research question is really how do people process this kind of information? And so really my question is, how do people cognitively process conspiracies? But not only how do they process, but what processing then leads people to want to share this information with others? And so I've turned to the DSMM, the differential susceptibility to media effects model, which by Valkenburg and Peter, which has kind of four main propositions. The first is that media effects are dependent on differential susceptibility variables, so dispositional, developmental, and social variables. Also that these media response states mediate the relationship between media use and media effects. Also that these differential susceptibility variables play kind of two different roles. They both predict media use, but they also moderate the relationship between media use and media response states. The fourth proposition is that media effects are what they call transactional. So they then in turn have effects on each of these other factors. Now, where my model exists is here where the cognitive, emotional, and excitative or arousal response states are, where they occur between media use and media effects. Now, for this study, I was focusing in on the dispositional factors of conspiracy mentality, which is one of the biggest predictors of conspiracy beliefs, and trait motivational reactivity, which is a big predictor of processing of emotional content, but also offline and online behavior. So again, my model kind of lives here. If you kind of zoom into the response states box, this is where my model resides. So again, this is in relation to processing conspiracy video content. So this is what the media use is in this case, but my model suggests that there are two basic routes one can take after processing this kind of information. One is a more kind of a belief or message acceptance route, where one would predict a possible suite of emotional reactions to occur, which would be coupled with high arousal. And then these would have predictive effects on cognitive response states. So you would predict that you would have higher perceived argument strength, lower counter arguing, and higher memory recognition of the message content. And then these would have predictive effects on the outcome. So media effects, or in this case, message adoption or rejection, and potential diffusion. Now, the other possible route that one can go after processing this kind of conspiracy content is potentially a completely neutral response where it has no effect on you whatsoever, which is probably a more rare situation. But more likely what would occur, and particularly for people more like us who don't necessarily buy into conspiracy message content, we might have what we call an anger reactance response. So reactance is generally associated with a cognitive fight response in detection of a freedom threat, but it can also be in response to someone trying to persuade you of information, someone trying to fool you, or frankly, someone trying to bullshit you with conspiracy messages. So in this case, you would have a kind of anger reactance response, which would be coupled with higher levels of arousal, which again would have predictive effects on cognitive response states. So you would assume or predict that there would be lower perceptions of argument strength, higher levels of counter arguing, and lower memory in these cases, which again, these would have differential effects on message adoption or rejection and diffusion outcomes. Now, all the while, we have the dispositional variables of conspiracy mentality and trait motivational reactivity that moderate, based on the DSMM, moderate the relationship between media use and the response state. So this is what these arrows here kind of signify. But where my model differs from the DSMM is it proposes that these variables then also moderate the relationship between response states and media effects, as signified by these arrows here. So again, as I mentioned, there's these possible emotional response states that one can experience in the message acceptance direction of the message processing. And so so one of these possible emotional reactions is the meta emotion of awe. Now, normally when most of us think about awe, we think about something like looking out at the Grand Canyon or seeing the cosmos or Earth from space, something like that. But in the literature, awe is associated with these feelings of confusion, amazement, surprise, wonder, but also this kind of aha or epiphany-like like eureka kind of feeling, which is associated with feelings of like discovery. And so Keltner and Haidt talk about how awe could be elicited by the discovery of a grand theory. Ostensibly what they're referring to are scientific theories, so more or less something like the theory of evolution or general relativity, something truly awe-inspiring. But it's my contention, my thesis, that this awe feeling could equally be elicited by conspiratorial messages. So if you're discovering that there's this hidden reality behind what you thought was reality, or you're discovering what the real truth really is, all of a sudden you're feeling this kind of aha, this kind of wow or whoa kind of feeling, which then would have effects on message processing. Now, the other possible emotion you may feel in response to this conspiracy content is, if you feel like the government's trying to turn the frogs gay, or if they're trying to keep your ivermectin from you, you may have this kind of feeling of threat, which anger is a kind of fight response to a threat detection. So again, if you think that this conspiracy is, working against your interests or the people around you, anger, this kind of fight response, may be one of the emotional responses. Now, the other emotion may be moral disgust that you would experience. So moral disgust is suggested to have been is an evolved emotion that was evolved in order to maintain social order in groups. So we feel moral disgust at deception and abuse of power, violations of people's dignity. These are kind of common tropes, common themes in conspiracy message content. And so moral disgust is a little different from the kind of visceral disgust that we feel in, response to spoiled food or corpses or something like that. Moral disgust is more of a kind of social disgust. Now, I mentioned that these emotions can have impacts and can affect the way we process these messages. And so this is based on the assumptions of the LC4MP, the limited capacity model of motivated mediated message processing, which itself has a few basic assumptions. The first is that the brain has a limited pool of resources to allocate to message encoding at any given time, or to message processing at any given time. And so this includes things like message encoding, storage, and retrieval. And that that message processing is influenced by two kind of motivational systems that humans have. One is an aversive system that helps us avoid bad things in our environment. And the other is an appetitive system that helps us kind of approach good things. And what's interesting is that these two systems can be activated at the same time, which is called a coactive state. And this is usually in response to seeing both good and bad content at the same time. So, for example, if I were to show you pictures of like negative, scary guns, right, this should elicit activation of your aversive system. Now, if I were to show you pictures of cute, cuddly, furry animals, right, this should elicit activation in your appetitive system. Now, what if I were to show you pictures of cute, cuddly, furry animals with guns, right? This is both positive and negative at the same time. This should elicit co-activation in your motivational systems. Now, my main kind of proposition here, my main thesis is that these conspiracy videos elicit these certain emotions, which we discussed, which likely elicits co-activation in the motivational systems. And that this co-activation elicits cognitive resource allocation out to encoding the message, which then prevents internal counter-arguing. And that so these certain emotions can kind of act to reduce counter-arguing, which leads to increased perceived argument strength, leaving people more susceptible to these kinds of messages. Now, I mentioned that I'm not only interested in how people cognitively process this kind of information, but also what kind of processing then leads people to want to share this kind of stuff with others. So here I've applied the diffusion of innovations theory, Rogers' diffusion of innovations, which itself has kind of 5 main components. It has the innovation or idea, which in this case is kind of a conspiracy idea. It has adopters, so the people who would adopt the conspiracy, communication channels like YouTube, time, and a social system through which to diffuse or spread. In this case, it's likely our social networks. And based on past research by Lang and Key, here I'm kind of operationalizing diffusion on social media as intentions to react instead of like is more the thing these days, but react, comment, and share on social media. And so based on past research, we know that political messages which evoke moral emotions related to like moral outrage are shared the most by people across the political spectrum, and that emotion eliciting Twitter messages are retweeted more often than and more quickly than just plain neutral ones. So it may be that these emotions are what's driving this conspiracy diffusion, these digital wildfires. So here I've kind of laid out my hypotheses, or the reasoning behind my hypotheses. As you can see, there's 14 of them, and within each there's like parts A through F. So as Justin kind of mentioned, there's a lot to cover here, and so for the sake of time, I won't go through all of them, but I'll just touch on some of the more important findings. But again, this is all in the process of developing and testing the CPDM. So to do this, I've implemented a 2x2 within subjects online experiment in which participants were asked to complete the conspiracy mentality and trait motivational reactivity measures up front. And then they were shown 4 video clips, so 2 conspiracy, 2 non-conspiracy, 2 high awe, 2 low awe, in randomized order. And then participants were asked to complete their emotional experience measures, their cognitive processing, their arousal, and then their diffusion intentions measures after each video clip. And then to index cognitive resource allocation to encoding, I used secondary task reaction times, STRTs, which is essentially a task in which participants are asked to press the spacebar on their keyboard as quickly as possible after the onset of several tones throughout the videos, which were strategically placed at 3 separate points throughout the videos. And I should note that the experiment was built using CyclePy and was hosted on Pavlovia. And so towards the end of the experiment, after participants had watched all of the 4 clips, they were shown 2 distractor clips and asked questions about them in order to kind of clear their working memory. And then they were given the encoding and memory task. And so other measures that we included, as I mentioned, conspiracy mentality and trait motivational reactivity were measured up front. And then I should also note that for awe, the AWS scale, which was developed to measure awe, includes several dimensions of awe. And so awe is a very complicated emotion. And so it obviously makes this experiment much more complicated, but there's 6 different dimensions of awe in the AWS scale. One of them was omitted because it's a kind of physical sensation of awe, so things like goosebumps, which I didn't really expect to occur for conspiracy processing, so that one was omitted. But I did measure each of the other 5 dimensions, which include time. So this is a perception of altered time or slowed time. Feelings of connectedness are related to feeling connected to nature or like kind of oneness with humanity. And then vastness is kind of what we mostly associate with awe. So this is the, a feeling of, looking out at the Grand Canyon or looking at the cosmos, this kind of vast expanse. And then self-loss is really should be more considered like self-diminishment. So, and it's somewhat related to vastness. So it's the feeling that you feel smaller in relation to either great power or this kind of vast expanse. And accommodation is the feeling of kind of rewiring your mental structures, rethinking how you think about the world based on experience and this awe-inducing information that's coming in. And so it's a kind of feeling that's the feeling of confusion that one experiences in these cases. And so after awe, we asked the other emotional experiences, as well as arousal, levels of counter-arguing, perceptions of message argument strength, levels of agreement, and then their diffusion intentions. The conspiracy clips were cut from a longer film, which was a kind of lesser known sequel to Plandemic, which was called Indoctrination. And this film included conspiracies not only about COVID-19, the pandemic, but also ones about corporate control of the media and the public narrative, the CIA, the World Health Organization, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, you name it, right? So it's all, there's a lot of different conspiracies within this one film, so it's a really good source to cut different clips from. The non-conspiracy clips were cut from just a PBS Frontline documentary called The Virus, What Went Wrong. And so we started off with 24 clips, which were pre-tested with 40 lab researchers and colleagues. And then we whittled down to 8 clips, so 4 conspiracy, 4 non. And then these were pre-tested with a larger group of 61 SONA participants using continuous response measures in the media lab in the CCR. Then based on those, 4 clips were selected. So the 2x2, 2 conspiracy, 2 non-conspiracy, high awe and low awe clips. And then this last bullet down here just shows that these clips were all significantly different from each other. The participants were recruited using Prolific, and 130 people completed the study initially, but after cleaning based on inattentiveness, speeding, and people just mashing the space bar over and over during the videos, which is not helpful, we ended up with 112, and then this is the demographic breakdown of those participants. So let's cover some of the results. So the first hypothesis was really looking at the effect of this conspiracy content on emotional responses. So my prediction was that people would report higher levels of awe in the conspiracy condition rather than the non-conspiracy condition. And so what we see here is that each dimension of awe, with exception of this connectedness, was higher in the conspiracy condition than the non-conspiracy condition. And indeed, 3 of the 5 different dimensions were significantly higher. So the time, self-loss, and accommodation dimensions were significantly higher, whereas the connectedness was not higher, but was actually lower, and then vastness was not significant. If we look at anger and disgust, here we see that both anger and disgust were significantly higher in the conspiracy condition than the non-conspiracy condition. And indeed, these were significant to a greater than or less than 0.001 level. So these hypotheses were supported. Anger and disgust were supported. Awe was partially supported. The second hypothesis was looking at the cognitive resource allocation between the different conditions. So the prediction was that people would pay more attention, so they would have higher reaction times in the conspiracy condition than the non. Results indicated, however, that there was no different, the 2 conditions were not statistically different related to reaction times. However, there was a significant effect of time on reaction times, such that the reaction times towards the ends of all the videos were significantly faster than they were towards the beginnings. So for each of the videos, people got quicker at doing the reaction times towards the ends. So this was counter to what my prediction was, so this hypothesis was not supported. Hypothesis 3, 4, and 5 were looking at the effects of emotion on cognition and arousal. So if we kind of focus down here at on the dimensions of awe first, we see that with reaction times, the only dimension of awe that was significantly associated with reaction times was vastness. The others were not, and so this prediction was only partially supported. And with counter-arguing, I predicted that higher levels of awe should be associated with lower levels of counter-arguing. Since these dimensions of time and accommodation were both positive relationships, this prediction was not supported. The same thing with memory. I predicted that higher dimensions of awe should be associated with higher memory, but we see an inverse relationship with time and connectedness, and so this prediction was also not supported. Now, if we look at argument strength, we do see that self-loss, connectedness, and vastness were significantly associated with arguments, higher perceptions of argument strength. So this prediction was partially supported, similar to agreement, levels of agreement. So connectedness and vastness were significantly associated with agreement. However, accommodation had a significant inverse relationship with agreement. So again, this hypothesis was only partially supported. However, if we look at arousal, all of the dimensions of awe seem to be significantly associated with higher levels of arousal. Indeed, so were anger and disgust here. Now, if we turn to the anger and disgust emotions, we see again there was no significant relationship with reaction times for these emotions. However, we do see that anger was significantly associated with higher levels of counter-arguing, which is counter to my prediction in the agreement direction of the model. So here you would expect lower levels of counter-arguing, and so this hypothesis here was not supported. However, if we look at perceptions of argument strength and agreement, we do see that both anger and disgust were both highly associated with perceptions of argument strength and levels of agreement, and also levels of arousal. So these hypotheses here were supported. Now, again, I mentioned that if you were to have a reactance response, this should be associated with higher levels of counter-arguing. And so here, this is what we see in this case. We see that anger was associated with higher levels of counter-arguing, which would indicate that maybe this is a reactance response in this case. However, what's kind of a head scratcher is that we also see in this case that anger again is associated with higher perceptions of argument strength and levels of agreement, which is counter to what I would have predicted if you were to have a reactance response. Here you would expect higher counter-arguing and lower message argument strength and lower agreement. So in this case, these two predictions were not supported. However, the counter-arguing was. The eighth hypothesis 8 was looking at the effects of emotion on diffusion intentions. And so what we see here is that each of the dimensions of awe that were measured were significantly associated with react, comment, and share intentions. And so were anger and disgust significantly associated with react, comment, and share intentions. And I should note and point out that here I use the tau, I think it's a tau symbol, for the significance at less than 0.001 level, just to kind of make this table a little bit cleaner. But these all these responses here, with exception of this one, are significant at the less than 0.001 level. So again, all the emotions that were measured here were significantly related to people's intentions to diffuse the messages. So the ninth hypothesis was looking at the dispositional effects on diffusion. And so here we see that conspiracy mentality was a significant predictor for all diffusion intentions, so react, comment, and share intentions. However, trait motivational reactivity was not a significant direct predictor of diffusion intentions. So we see that none of these significant p-values are in the significant level. So what are some of the takeaways of this work? So we do see that conspiracy messages, conspiracy videos do seem to elicit these kind of emotional responses that were discussed earlier, and that these emotions, for whatever reason, don't seem to prevent internal counter arguing, but they are associated with higher perceived argument strength, higher message agreement, and higher likelihood for diffusion, which I think is the more important takeaway here than the level of internal counter arguing. And so that's kind of in a nutshell, that's what I have. And so I'll open it up to questions now.
Justin, are we doing public questions first?
Yeah, so if anybody from the public has any questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can just go ahead and unmute and turn on your camera, and then we'll have a little bit of a public discussion for the next 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how many questions there are, and then we'll go on to the next stage. So if you have any questions and you're not a part of the committee, now's a great time to speak up. If you are a part of the committee and something just comes up in natural conversation, obviously we can have that discussion now too, but we can also save some of the committee questions for later. So.
Hey, Alex, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I haven't used it a long time. Okay, cool.
Hi, Sherry.
I'm going to ask you the same question I ask at every dissertation or thesis defense. What is the favorite thing that you learned through this whole process?
Favorite thing that I learned?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's a tough question. How difficult it is to run experiments, particularly online. There's a lot to it, and especially I would say that any future dissertation takers like yourself should try as best as you can to make your predictions as simple as possible, make your dissertation as simple as possible, and don't do your opus like I did, or just don't make it as complicated as possible.
What have I been saying since the first day of grad school?
Yes. Listen to Ashley. That's essentially what I'm saying.
If only your chair had told you multiple times this doesn't have to be your opus. And yeah, here we are with 14 predictions and 89,000 analyses. So
yeah, I was gonna say it was a really big one. There was a lot of theories in there and a lot of dependent variables. I was like, wow, that's amazing. It was very cool.
So there's actually, you see my 14 hypotheses, there's parts A through F with many of them. And then because I decided to measure all of the dimensions of awe, there's 5 dimensions of awe with each of those, and then 3 diffusion measures. So
and Alex, you asked the explicit measure of awe too, right?
Oh, not in the final study, just in the pretests.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say, because then we could simplify it down for a paper where you just say, like, did you experience awe?
Yeah, but so when you add them all up, like when you multiply it all together, it comes out to like 89 different predictions to be tested.
That's a lot.
And I will say this too, Alex went and literally learned a programming language to learn how to do this. I mean, he had some experience with R and Python, but he went and learned how to do an online experiment using PsychoPy, which is non-trivial. And he learned how to get all that data out, and it turns out that it spits it out in a really weird way. And so he had to learn how to readjust all that data, and he and I spent hours looking at it on Teams calls. And then he went and did all the he did an impressive amount of like back end stuff just to get to what you saw today, to get to that document. And I'm wildly impressed that he was able to pull it off, because it's pretty awesome. So
Really cool study.
Thank you, Sheree. I think that just to follow up on that, I think the fact that these emotions do occur, it was kind of predicted. I mean, I predicted that they would occur, but actually seeing that they do happen was also pretty interesting. And now it's weird to like think, because my mind has already reverted to the fact that, oh yeah, it's obvious that these emotions do occur. Like I've already found it, like they do occur. And so my mind has already gone from, oh, is this possible that maybe these do happen, to like, okay, yeah, it's kind of obvious. So it's a weird mental transition that I have to remind myself that it's interesting that these emotions actually are occurring.
Well, I have sort of a follow-up to that too.
Okay.
And just because you're still talking about now, I mean, normally I would defer to the rest of the public first, but I want to say, so there was a couple things that you were sort of curious about, like why you saw this thing with current counter arguing, but also with those emotions, you brought up the differential susceptibility to media effects at the beginning, and you pointed out that one of the propositions is that those dispositional variables moderate those response states, right? Those emotions when exposed to the media. And so my question is, and I know that your sample wasn't huge, so you don't want to cut it up too much, but did you, and I also read your dissertation, but I've been super sick this week, and so not much of it stuck. I just remember being impressed. Did you look at did you actually look at that moderated relationship? Did you look at the interactions between conspiracy mentality and the exposure or whatever on those emotions to see if the emotions were different from people who basically were more or less likely to buy the argument?
I looked at the interactions between so I looked at if conspiracy mentality and trait motivational activity moderated the relationship between the response states and the diffusion intention. So we did see that with both ASA and DSA were significant moderators of, so the trait motivational activity was a significant moderator of counter arguing and a message agreement with then diffusion intentions. But you were asking about the emotional
experimental
experience.
Yeah, so the experimental, well, and this can get kind of messy, so maybe the way to look at it would be to actually just do an analysis separate, because you wouldn't necessarily want the relative difference between the different videos, but you would, like, let's say for example you just selected the data from those who watched the conspiracy video, or I guess they all watched it, but from their conspiracy videos, and looked at the relationship between conspiracy mentality and those emotional responses. Just for those who watch the conspiracy video, to see how those emotions vary depending. It's almost like I'd like to look at a figure, right, where even though the relationship is continuous, because conspiracy mentality is a continuous measure, if you looked at like those who scored in, so for example, in the paper that you and I did with Othello on the DSMM, with regard to the flat earth videos, we graphed how people sort of responded, specifically the cognitive responses, but how those looked different for people in the top 25% of conspiracy mentality scores in the sample and the bottom 25% in conspiracy mentality scores in the sample. And you could see like which group is more angry, for example, right? Are the people who have low conspiracy mentality more angry because they're seeing content that they think is like fake news? Yeah. Or are people who are high conspiracy mentality more angry because they're mad that this is occurring in the world?
Right. Yeah.
Or is there a difference? Are they both equally mad, but then for different reasons?
Right. Yeah. So I did look at conspiracy mentality effects on emotions. That's one of the hypotheses I left out in the presentation, but right. I did see that conspiracy mentality was significantly. It was a predictor for all experiences. I don't think all of them, but I think if my memory, or I think most of the dimensions of awe, but then also anger and disgust.
And is
But
that collapsed? Is that
No.
collapsed across clips?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
It was collapsed across clips.
It's for all clips, not.
Okay, I would actually be interested in pulling out
Yeah.
the conspiracy clip
Conspiracy,
specifically and just doing like a simple effects analysis on that to see, you know, response to that. And I mean, because if you look at it across clips, right, you're just saying in general,
Yeah.
if you do an interaction effect with clips, then you're looking at a relative difference in their response between, like, the difference between those with lower and those with higher conspiracy mentality between the two different types of clips. So I think it would be a simpler effect to understand just to look at the conspiracy clips and not recognizing, and I don't think it needs to be put in the dissertation. I just want to see what happened.
Yeah, I agree.
I guess one more question. You said that this was like your big opus, but what do you plan on doing next with in this line of research? I know you're in industry now, but are you planning on continuing on and studying this further?
Yes, I do. This was intended to be the first attempt at testing this model, and so there's still a lot that I want to continue testing with this model and kind of proving it out in different kinds of experiments, different kind of conspiracy content. I've also wanted to look at, originally I wanted to look at diffusion in a live kind of scenario in which people are actually actively going through a fake kind of social media site and seeing how they like diffuse or see people how they engage with the content on a kind of artificial social media site. You're right, I am in industry right now, and so it's kind of going to be kind of juggling two goals of that work, but also my science related work. But yeah, I do plan to continue testing this model and proving it out.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
Right. Stop sharing. Oh, there's more people.
All right, if there's no other questions from the public, then if you're not a part of the committee, go ahead and you can say your thanks in the chat and then head on out, and we will have the private portion of the defense start up once everybody's gone.
Thank you, everyone.